Hi everyone, welcome back at Charlotte from At Charlotte's House. Today I am going to share a super simple stenciled tote bag that you can make using your Cricut. Stay tuned. A couple of weeks ago I shared a stenciled tote bag that my kids helped me make for their teachers to give at the end of the school year. Just about all of you asked to see how I made it. Today I'm going to do something a little bit different, but I'm going to follow the same steps, and I thought it would be sort of a nice little introduction to the Cricut, and I think you guys will enjoy. My Cricut is maybe 3 or 4 years old, so there's definitely more recent versions, but I think the steps will basically be the same. I was given this tote bag at an event, and it's basically plain. I think there's a logo on the back that you can barely see. So I'm going to stencil something on this side very similar to what we did for the teachers. For the teachers, we did a monogram. For this, I have something a little bit more interesting because I'm going to be using this bag, but I promise the steps are the same. Whenever you're working with the Cricut, here's the basic materials that you need to have. Obviously, you need your Cricut. I don't use mine all that often. I actually haven't changed too many of the things, but this is the blade that came with my Cricut. Sometimes if you want to cut different materials, you'll need to change that blade. This is the same old blade that I've had the whole time. You're going to need a cutting mat. This is the standard 12 by 12 inch mat. They have different size mats. This one tends to work for me. You're going to need vinyl or whatever it is you're cutting out. I'm using just some basic vinyl as a stencil essentially, but you can have something that would be iron-on. You can have fabric. You can have very thin wood. This is the material that's going to be cut by my Cricut. And then for me, I have this transfer paper, and this is some leftover stuff that I got online a while ago. Cricut obviously makes some. The transfer paper is important because you won't be able to move whatever you've cut out of this super thin adhesive vinyl onto whatever it is you are stenciling without the help of this. So what you are looking at is the design that I plan to cut out of my vinyl that will ultimately be a stencil for me. And before you can do anything on your Cricut, you need to design it like I've done. So I have downloaded the Cricut Design Space. It may be different for the newer models, but for my model, this is where I start. Once I open up my design space, I can either choose from other projects that people have done and literally copy their design. I can search for different shapes. I can search for different images and different graphics. Typically, you have to spend maybe $1 to $5 depending on how complicated that design is, unless you are able to design one yourself. So I have made this using a combination of shapes. So these are just rectangles, and then text. Obviously, you see that here. So I have made sure that this is lined up. I know this is big enough to not only fit on my cutting mat, but it also is about the right size for my bag. So this is your first step, designing what you want to cut or what you want to print in the Cricut Design Space. Here's my design all ready to go. So I'm going to come over, I'm going to click Make It. Now, I want you to notice this is the first problem. That is not how I laid everything out in the design studio, and this is not gonna work for a stencil. So let's cancel. Here's what I'm gonna have to do. I'm gonna select all, and then I'm gonna come over here, and I'm gonna click Attach. It may be in a different place depending on what version you're using, but I'm gonna select all, I'm gonna click Attach, and now I'm going to come back and click Make It again. That looks perfect. That's exactly how I want to cut it out. Now, this is the point if you want to shift your design just a little bit, you can. So it's on the cutting mat a little bit differently. I'm going to center mine ever so slightly and just tease it down. And now I'm going to hit Continue. So this is connecting to my Cricut device. I'm going to move you over and show you the next step. Okay, this Cricut mat is adhesive. It has a slight tackiness to it. So I've gone ahead and I've pressed my Cricut vinyl onto that tackiness. Now, I'm going to feed this into my Cricut machine, and it's actually prompting me to load the mat. It needs to be pulled into the machine, I don't know, an inch or so. Once it's loaded, my computer is prompting me to select the material. So I'm going to select the material here. Mine is older, and so I'm just twisting this dial to select which type. I can also come over here to custom, and I have different choices there. So my mat is loaded. I've selected the proper material, which is vinyl. I have my design ready to go. So now I am going to press the C, and it's going to start cutting. So you can't tell, but I can see the fine lines of where my Cricut has cut this out. So if it's cut it out correctly, it doesn't go all the way through the vinyl, which is the genius of the Cricut. So I'm gonna pull this piece of vinyl off of my mat, and I'm done with this. Here's where the transfer paper comes in handy. So I'm gonna peel back the top inch of my transfer paper, and then I'm gonna line it up on my vinyl. So I've lined up my transfer paper with my vinyl. I'm not worried about wrinkles. And I'm gonna slowly remove the back of the transfer paper as I smooth it out on top of my vinyl. Again, it does not have to be neat. Air bubbles are not a problem. I simply want this paper to be here to hold my pattern in place. So now I can remove the back of my vinyl. This is where you need fingernails. I don't have fingernails. So I'm gonna remove this carefully because I don't want any of that vinyl to come away with the backing right now, which is easier said than done. But I'm just going slowly, and if I notice that the vinyl is peeling up with the back, I'm just kind of putting it back in place. And this is the sticky side of the vinyl. Reminder, this is sticky. Now, I want to make sure I have a general idea of where I want the top of this to go and where the middle point is. Looks straight to me. Now I can carefully pull away that transfer paper, leaving behind that vinyl that I'm using as a stencil. I always go back over and just make sure my edges are pretty well smoothed down. It doesn't have to be perfect. I like to be a little careful with the stencil, and I usually add a couple inches of just painter's tape to protect myself from any drips. Here comes the fun part, stenciling. I have some fabric paint here. This I just got at Michael's. This is Fabric Creations by Plaid, it looks like. I've used lots of fabric paints, and I think most of them typically work, especially for something like a bag that I'm not going to be laundering all the time. Now, I'm actually not using anything other than a piece of scrap paper, and then I have this round sponge that I love using because it's the right size, and it makes it really easy to sort of tap, tap, tap. So I'm going to mix my first color. So I'm going to start with this blue. And I like doing it on paper because then it just gives me a built-in way to sort of dab off the excess paint. So whenever you're stenciling, you want to make sure that you don't have too much paint on your sponge or your pouncer or your brush. If there's too much, the paint will seep in under the lines of your stencil and you're not going to like the results. So I am going to start with this dark blue, and I'm just going to go right straight down across the top, and I'm getting a little bit of paint, and then I'm tapping it on the paper so there's not too much. Notice how light my paint is on my sponge. Again, I don't want that paint to seep in underneath my stencil. So I'm gonna do lots of light coats versus one super heavy-handed coat. Now at this point I could rinse my sponge, but I actually love the look of these paints when they're allowed to mix just a little bit. So I'm not gonna do anything to that sponge, and I'm just gonna come over here and I'm gonna pick up some lighter blue. The nice thing about working in sort of a rainbow order is that the colors blend into each other very well. I have finished my stencil, and I've let the paint dry just a little bit so it's not super drippy on the stencil itself, but I'm usually pretty impatient to see how it looks, so let's try this. If that is not a beautiful sight, I don't know what is. So I'm gonna let this dry. I'm also gonna read over the instructions on the fabric paint just to make sure I don't need to iron it or do anything to set it, but I would say that is a success. Don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel, and have a great day, everyone.